Jonathan, you were involved some years ago in creation and maintenance of the TeX, the frequently asked questions. And I have peeked at it on occasion, but at intervals of years. I'm not a regular user of it. Does it contain examples of here's what the complete input for a poem, for a journal article, for a book, for a personal letter look like?
As I recall, it doesn't. It will have small examples of code. I think the TeX FAQ is well worth looking at. It's changed a lot since I was active in it. It sort of fell into abeyance, and then it's become HTML only. It used to be both PDF and HTML. And Joseph Wright has taken a sort of responsibility for it, but it doesn't seem to have the community involvement that existed when I was there. So I'm regarding it as a piece of history rather than something which we can learn from, but not something that's suitable for active development.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
When Nelson said that these various companies are in competition, I thought it was going to say they're incompetent. That's my experience, having these things, the input processed into some other format, and so many errors were introduced. So it's apparently not a trivial problem. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had to go through 8 proofs.
Yeah, no. This is indeed an issue. I can give a little bit of perspective because the cousin of my wife in South India actually works in this area. And she has a bachelor's degree in science, so she has had exposure to chemistry and physics and mathematics. But she's not a subject matter expert. And of course, these companies are contracted by big publishers like Springer and Elsevier and so on, to deal with possibly hundreds of different journals with very broad subject area. And so the people at their end, at the production end, won't recognize problems that are related to a particular subject. For example, capitalization of names. Take the name Green function. In mathematics, Green was a mathematician who was well known and has had a very important influence on mathematics, but someone who doesn't know much math would assume that was a color. And so the name would appear with a lowercase g instead of the correct capitalized green. And this problem is certainly pervasive. A thing I notice that as I'm dealing with more and more web pages for journal metadata that I convert to BibTeX form is that some human is typing these in, and they are utterly and thoroughly confused by the fact that Unicode has multiple forms of dashes. I mean, in TeX we have a hyphen, a minus sign, an N dash, and an M dash. So we have 4, but there's only 3 input forms for those. The hyphen and the minus are distinguished by whether they're used in math mode or not. But what I find at publisher sites is just utter confusion. The dashes are almost always wrong and almost always need repair.
Yeah, I've often seen the tilde confused with the proportional sign.
Yes, that happens too. And another problem that is significant is that there seems to be an assumption on the part of these publishers that a transcription of mathematics into a series of Unicode characters that somewhat match the mathematics is sufficient. And so they don't understand, for example, that the radical sign for a square root has to cover the thing that it's the square root thereof. And so you'll see a square root sign followed by x plus y, and you don't know whether the square root applies just to the x or to the sum of x and y, because they really ought to have put parentheses around it. And a glyph that indicates the radical really needs to be one that covers the thing it applies to. And in Unicode, it doesn't. It's just the beginning of the radical?
Make the best of what there is the piece of advice I find myself in my old age keep on coming back to. Not make the best of what you hope there is or what they think there is, but make the best of what there is. And an adjunct to that is choose your battles, choose your problems carefully. So I think we do have to accept a certain amount of, I use the word unsatisfactoriness. But if we can make the best of what there is in terms of taking into account where we are and what our capabilities are, then that will take us forward. Another version of that is to pick the low-hanging fruit to solve the problems that can easily be solved. But there are enormous problems also related to the massive growth of computerization and the globalization and all manner of other things. And we have to do what we can where we are. I sort of feel that I've put a lot of effort into tech and I know a lot about tech, and so I've sort of got a special responsibility here that I should be discharging. But not everybody else will see that in the same way.
I'd like to address a question to Doug McKenna. With your work with JSBox, you essentially set out to do a clean room re-implementation of tech and achieved a goal that only one other person in the world has ever achieved, and that's passing of the trip test of your software, which I think is truly remarkable. When you look back on this substantial intellectual and programming exercise, were there parts of the input interpretation that were totally mind-boggling and caused a huge amount of grief for you?
Well, I gotta say a couple things to that. I mean, first of all, my interpreter and any other interpreter pretty much has to follow the exact same algorithms that are in, Don's original tech, because it is the algorithm, and or the set of sub algorithms. So it's a specification for all those algorithms, and that's the specification I used, but I just wrote it completely in C using my own ideas of how to do C software, et cetera, et cetera. And as far as, there are, the definition of passing the trip test is well defined, but not necessarily helpful. I mean, I can output all the right mathematical results, but if I have an error message that's written differently, technically I haven't passed the trip test. And one of the things that we've been talking about is all these automated tools for doing this and that, and it's based on formal grammar specifications and all this. And in general, such tools have poor user interfaces because their ability to report errors is kind of second rate. And my philosophy is do the best you can to communicate to the user and don't use generic algorithmic, messages. So in my interpreter, I have a completely different means of reporting errors, which technically is different from how tech communicates with the user. And since the trip test is based on comparing two files that have to be identical, it's not clear that I'm passing the trip test there. with that said, I mean, an interpreter doesn't know what code it's running. No tech interpreter is going to know that it's running LaTeX unless it has, special, some special parameter value or something that gets set. I mean, it doesn't know that it's running LaTeX. So having a low-level interpreter being able to parse any possible tech source code is not necessarily, I mean, my initial reaction is that's a really hard problem to leverage into some way to help create a LaTeX, legality tool of some sort. So that's the thought there. And then, some other thoughts that have come to mind during the discussion are, when I was writing the interpreter, I decided that I was going to create source code in C that had its own markup language so that I could create a really nice typeset version of the code. And so I developed that and I use that internally still. It's mostly finished, but it's really hard. So what it does is it takes C source files, it processes them with its own markup language and outputs LaTeX or LaTeX. And that the idea is that it has to compile in LaTeX, without any errors. And that's doing that well with C code is really quite a lot of work. And I'm not using a formal C language parser to do that, so it's a giant hack. But one of the problems with outputting LaTeX code is, I have to be really careful to make sure that it doesn't do anything that's out on the edges. It has to be very straightforward and so forth. But there are packages in LaTeX that have errors and bugs. And so I'll get on the, what happened recently was I had an error propping up in the formatting of code in using color boxes, et cetera. And so I was given a patch to add in. So I added that in and it fixed the problem. But of course, the patch is dipping down into the bowels of LaTeX or some package in LaTeX, and it's changing @ sign to a letter and doing all that stuff. And it's all low-level tech to fix some bug. And that has to be added in order to do the right thing, at least going back a couple of years for people who have, LaTeX from, or Tech Live from 2019 or whatever. Going forward, maybe I could get rid of that. But so if I take the output of this translation program from C to LaTeX, is it going to pass, one of these tests that you guys have been all talking about? I don't know. The ideal is you take this file and you give it to LaTeX and there's no errors. And so maybe that's good enough. But anyway, there's all these problems, that I can't wrap my head around altogether. But, even in my own markup language, I'm coming into conflict with other markup languages like Doxygen and for C code and so forth. And so it's a giant can of worms and kind of, and it arises, at least in the tech world, because tech language is so low level and syntax, every letter can be made to mean something different and so forth, and it's Turing complete and all those issues. And I'm just rambling now, but anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on a bunch of the things that have been said.